Welcome back, Highlanders, to the second and final lecture video for Chapter 13. This particular chapter is relatively short, so we only have two lecture videos for it. In the first one, we talked about the three functions of money, or the important functions that money serves in an economy. The reason why it's important to have a currency rather than try to trade goods for other goods. We also talked a little bit about some basic banking definitions, as well as the fractional reserve system, which showed us how banks can create money through that fractional reserve system. And we talked a little bit about the required reserve ratio and how the money multiplier is just 1 over that required reserve ratio. And again, it shows us how much money can be multiplied throughout the economy when some money is injected based off of what that required reserve ratio is. So now we're going to talk about in this chapter the Federal Reserve System and how it conducts monetary policy. So with that in mind, right, the Federal Reserve System here in the United States, or the Fed, is the name of the central bank, and it is instructed by Congress to conduct monetary policy in a manner that promotes two things. So again, when we talk about the Federal Reserve System, it sounds like it's a government entity because of the word federal, but again, it's kind of a private organization, but does have a lot of interaction with the government, and is instructed by the government to, again, do two things. Unfortunately, these two things often conflict with one another. The first thing it needs to do is promote full employment. That means doing things like using expansionary monetary policy when we are in a recession. So if the economy looks like it's headed towards some bad times, the Fed might increase the money supply in an effort to stimulate the economy and pull us out of that recession. Unfortunately, as we talked about in Chapter 8, increasing the money supply leads to inflation, and the other thing that the Fed needs to do is keep that inflation in check or keep those prices relatively stable. So the same expansionary monetary policy that it uses to pull the economy out of recession or satisfy that first goal is in direct conflict with that second goal of price stability. So it's got to be very careful about using that expansionary monetary policy. It can't use too much or it's going to create inflation, or it can't use it at the wrong time or it could create inflation, right? If it starts to see some inflation happening, then it needs to use restrictive monetary policy. And that restrictive monetary policy is the idea of reducing money supply, which could really slow down or halt the economy. So you got to be careful about when you use that and how much of that you use, or you could cause the very recessions or depressions that the Fed is trying to avoid with its first goal of creating full employment. So the Federal Reserve System has the difficult task of accomplishing a very delicate balancing act. So it's not surprising that it often struggles to do it fairly effectively. Right, a lot of economists, including Milton Friedman, believe that the Federal Reserve System is to blame for most of the major economic collapses by using restrictive monetary policy at the wrong time and making other mistakes like that. So the Fed struggles to accomplish both of these goals at the same time, but let's talk a little bit about who's in charge of accomplishing these goals. So what you have here are the 12 central banks that comprise the Federal Reserve System. So we got Bank 1 in Boston, Bank 2 is in New York, then we got banks in Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. So 12 major cities throughout the United States. Now I don't care that you remember those particular banks or what order they're in, but I'm going to show you a trick that you can kind of use with your dollar bill to see where your dollar bill was printed. So what we have here is a standard $1 bill. As you can see, this $1 bill has the number 2 in each of these corners here. This number 2 corresponds with the second letter in the alphabet, or the letter B. And so you always see that be the case. So if it was the number 3 there, then that would be the letter C there in the middle. And around that letter B, you can see that black insignia there saying that this dollar bill was printed at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Right, so you can see that this bill was printed in the Federal Reserve Bank there in New York, right? Again, number 2 on this list. If you see like a number 3 in those corners and a C in the middle, you'll see that it is printed at the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia, right? And so you can see where your $1 bills are printed by using that trick there, just in case you're curious. That's not something I'm going to ask you on the exam. It's not necessarily something that I really care that you know. But I learned it in my introduction to macroeconomics class, so I guess I feel like you should have learned it. But in any case, there it is. So it's at least a talking point that you can make at parties. But again, I'm never going to ask you to list out the 12 banks or where they are. I'm just kind of giving you an idea of where you can find them. Now, each one of those banks has a bank president, And there's also 7 board of governors, of which one of those is the chairperson of the Fed. Currently, that individual, Jerome Powell. Again, before him, it was Janet Yellen, who was the first female ever chairperson of the Fed. And then before her, it was Ben Bernanke. And you go on and so forth and so on back to see who the former chair people were. But what happens is that 5 of these bank presidents, along with all 7 board of governors, combine to form the 12 members of what is called the Federal Open Market Committee. And we're going to talk about open market operations being one of the primary tools of the Fed for conducting this monetary policy, right? So this is a pretty powerful committee. Again, on that committee, you have all 7 board of governors. We'll just abbreviate that as BOG. And then you have the 5 bank presidents. And those 5 bank presidents include the one from New York. That bank president is always on that committee, right? New York being a very powerful place where Wall Street is located, right? And then the other 4 bank presidents are on there on a rotating basis, right? So it rotates between the other 4, right? Again, that's not something I'm really going to expect you to know for the exam, but again, I had to learn it in my intro to macroeconomics class, so I guess now you must learn it. But anyway, in case you're curious, right, that's kind of what comprises that Federal Open Market Committee. All right, so let's talk about how the Fed controls the money supply through this monetary policy. Right. Again, the number one tool that the Fed uses to conduct monetary policy or change the money supply is what is known as open market operations. And open market operations is just the buying and selling of bonds. So when the Fed buys bonds, it increases the money supply. So here's the kind of way to think about how this works. So let's imagine that this box here represents the economy. And this over here represents the Federal Reserve, right? So what's going to happen is, let's say that somebody in this economy has a $100 bond. Maybe it's a bond at 5% interest, right? That's going to mature in, say, a year or so, right? So what happens is that if the Fed wants to increase the money supply, it's going to buy back that bond out of the economy. So what's going to happen is that the bond goes to the Fed. So the Fed gets the bond. Having said that, in order to get the bond, the Fed has to pay back that $100 plus the interest. So that's $105 that now gets thrown into that person's hands, right? So the economy now has $105 more dollars in it, right? So that's one way that the Fed could increase the money supply is by buying back these bonds, right? Now, if the Fed wanted to decrease the money supply, then it would sell bonds in the first place, right? So the Fed wanted to take, say, $100 out of the economy, right? Then it would send that bond to somebody or sell that bond to somebody, right? In exchange, that person would give that $100 to the Fed, and now there's $100 less floating around in the economy. So if the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, it will sell bonds, and then if it wants to increase the money supply, it will buy those bonds back. That's one way that they kind of inject money into the economy. So you're thinking, like, how does the Fed increase the money supply? Well, they don't just drop dollar bills from a big blimp or plane hovering over cities, right? They do it through means like this, right? So again, buying bonds increases the money supply, selling bonds decreases it. This is what is known as open market operations, and this is what is done by that Federal Open Market Committee that consists of those 7 board of governors and 5 bank presidents, right? And again, this is the number one tool that the Fed uses to conduct monetary policy. So again, these are the people probably most responsible for changing the money supply for better or worse. Again, according to a lot of economists, perhaps worse throughout our nation's history. Right? It's not that they're trying to do a bad job, it's just a hard job to do. And we'll talk about why in Chapter 14. All right, so another way that the Fed controls the money supply is through what is known as reserve requirements. And we already talked about this one in the first lecture video for this chapter. Right, lower reserve requirements means that the bank has to hold on to less money, so that's more money that they can loan out, and that's going to increase the money supply by increasing the size of that multiplier. So as that required reserve ratio is lower, the money multiplier is bigger, right? The bank has to, by law, hold on to fewer dollars. That gives them more money to loan out, which is going to increase that money supply. Now, if the Fed wanted to lower the money supply or practice that restrictive monetary policy, then it would just increase the reserve requirements or force those banks to hold on to more of those deposits. That's less they can loan out, and that will make that money multiplier smaller. So we already highlighted this one in the last video, but lower reserve requirements will increase the money supply. Higher reserve requirements will reduce the size of the multiplier or reduce the money supply. So that's the second way that the Fed controls the money supply, is by, again, deciding and changing how much banks have to hold on to with regards to their deposits. Now, another way that the Fed controls the money supply is through the extension of loans. Remember that the Federal Reserve System is kind of like the banks for your commercial banks. So in the same way that Bank of America can give you a loan, the Federal Reserve can give Bank of America a loan. And just like you have to pay an interest rate for the loan you get from Bank of America, right? Bank of America has to pay an interest rate to the Fed for any loans they get from the Federal Reserve. And that interest rate that the Fed charges is called the discount rate, right? So discount rate is just the interest rate that Fed charges the commercial banks to borrow funds, right? So with that in mind, as you can imagine, with a higher interest rate, you're less likely to borrow money. With a lower interest rate, you're going to be more likely to borrow money. Well, the same is true for these commercial banks like Bank of America, right? If the discount rate that the Fed charges Bank of America is lower, right, then Bank of America is going to want to borrow more money, so the Fed's going to extend more loans, and that's more money that Bank of America can then loan out to other individuals, and that's going to increase the money supply. Right, so if the Federal Reserve wants to practice that expansionary monetary policy, again, maybe they think the economy is headed towards a recession or some bad times, then one thing they can do is lower the discount rate or lower that interest rate that the Fed's charging these commercial banks, and that's going to encourage these commercial banks to borrow more money and extend more loans. Now, if the Fed is worried about inflation and wants to reduce the money supply or practice that restrictive monetary policy, then it will raise the discount rate or increase the interest rate that it charges these commercial banks for borrowing money. And in that way, the Fed would extend less loans because these commercial banks are not eager to borrow money at that higher interest rate, and that will decrease the money supply. Right, so again, that's one way that the Fed controls the money supply. And up until the 2008-2009 financial crisis, these first three ways were the only three ways that the Fed controlled the money supply. But since then, a fourth way has come about, and that is the interest paid on excess reserves. Right, so in the same way that when you deposit money at Bank of America, you get an interest in your on that money deposited in your savings account. Remember, I told you that Bank of America can deposit money at the Federal Reserve, and any deposits they have with the Federal Reserve will also they can also receive interest on that from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve will pay interest on deposits at the Fed in the same way that Bank of America will pay you interest for any deposits you have with that bank, right? So if they really want to encourage banks to not deposit money at the Fed but loan it out to individuals instead, then they're going to reduce the interest they pay on those excess reserves. That way, banks will say, all right, it's not worth it to keep the money at the Fed anymore. Let's just loan it out instead. Having said that, the Fed wants to reduce the money supply or restrict it for whatever reason, maybe to, again, control those inflationary booms, then it's going to raise or increase the interest rate paid on those excess reserves, because that's then going to encourage banks like Bank of America to put more money in deposits at the Fed and loan out less so that it will you have less money fluctuating throughout the economy. Right, so with that in mind, again, it's going to reduce that interest that they pay on these excess reserves to increase the money supply or practice that expansionary monetary policy, and it will increase the interest paid on excess reserves to reduce the money supply or practice that restrictive monetary policy. So reduce the interest rate to increase money supply, increase the interest rate to reduce the money supply. All right, so with that in mind, I know there are four different ways that the Fed can control the money supply, and I know that can be complicated, but I want you to know all four ways. So I've kind of created this chart to kind of help summarize everything up for you. So what we have here are the four different kinds of Federal Reserve policy, or four ways that they conduct monetary policy, and then the type of policy they conduct, expansionary and restrictive, and what they would do with respect to each of those four ways to conduct that particular type of policy. So if the Fed wants to use expansionary monetary policy, again, its most common tool is those open market operations, so it'd be most likely to purchase those government bonds, right? Buy those bonds back from the public, right? With that in mind, if it wants to Increase money supply. It could also lower reserve requirements, which will increase the size of that money multiplier, right, as banks are going to be able to loan out more money. They could also lower the discount rate, right, or lower the interest rate that they charge these commercial banks, and that way banks will be more likely to borrow money from them. So they extend more loans to banks, and that'll give the banks more money to loan out to individuals, so money supply could be increased that way. Or again, they could reduce the interest rate paid on the excess reserves, and in that way, banks will be less likely to keep their deposits at the Fed and more likely to loan that money out instead. So all of those are ways that they could practice expansionary monetary policy, which is what, again, they would do if they felt the economy was headed towards some economically bad times and needed some recovery. Right. During this coronavirus pandemic, you might be aware of the fact that interest rates are particularly low, and one reason why is because the Federal Reserve has tried to keep these interest rates low in an effort to stimulate economic activity. Now, if the Fed starts worrying about inflation because they've injected too much money into the economy, again, we talked about in Chapter 8, a big increase in the money supply relative to the increase in goods and services could lead to some inflation, and that's something that could be bad for the economy. So the Fed might want to control that with this restrictive monetary policy, which involves selling government bonds, so again, giving people these pieces of paper and taking money out of the economy. Or they could raise the reserve requirements, which would lower the size of the money multiplier and give banks less money to loan out to individuals, less money, again, flowing through the economy. They could also raise the discount rate or the interest rate they charge the banks for borrowing money from them, and that way the banks will be less eager to borrow that money, and the Fed's going to extend fewer loans. Or again, they could increase the interest they pay on excess reserves, and that will encourage banks to keep more money at the Fed and loan out less money to the public. So all those are ways that they could reduce the money supply if they felt that inflation was imminent or about to happen. Right, so that is it for this particular chapter. Make sure you know the three functions of money. Right, again, it's a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. Know why those are important for economic prosperity. Know what's contained in the M1 definition of money. Right, remember that is your currency or those cash and coins plus checkable deposits plus traveler's checks. That is the most liquid form of money, or again, the one that's focused on that medium of exchange function. Know what's contained in M2. First of all, it's everything in M1, right? The currency, the checking account, and the traveler's checks, plus things like your savings account or savings deposits, right? Those small denomination time deposits and those money market mutual funds. Those are things that are less liquid forms of money, right? So M2 really has a much broader definition of money, and it focuses more on that store of value function of money. Right? Know what the required reserve ratio is. That's the percentage of deposits that banks have to keep on hand and how it affects the money multiplier. The smaller the required reserve ratio, the bigger the money multiplier, and thus the bigger the potential increase in the money supply. The bigger the required reserve ratio, the smaller the money multiplier, and thus the smaller the potential increase in the money supply. And know the four ways the Fed conducts monetary policy that we talked about in that last summary chart. Right? Remember, there's open market operations. There's changing those required reserve ratios. There's changing the discount rate or extending more or less loans. And there's changing the interest that they pay these commercial banks on excess reserves. Right? Know how they use these four ways of conducting monetary policy to conduct both expansionary monetary policy as well as restrictive monetary policy. So that is it for Chapter 13. We just got one more chapter to go, Chapter 14, on how this monetary policy can affect the economy. And then we will have completed this course and you climb up the macroeconomic mountain. Right, until then, just let me know if you have any questions. Again, you can always shoot me that email or visit me during those Zoom office hours. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So just let me know if you need anything, and take care.